The cosmos had never seemed so forbidding to James as when the warning alarms pierced the calm of their small spacecraft. Beside him, Lyra, his Zytherian friend and classmate from the Intergalactic Academy, gripped the controls with a steadiness that belied her inner turmoil. Her large, opalescent eyes flickered with reflections of the flashing dashboard lights as she fought to stabilize their craft. "James, brace for impact." Lyra's voice was calm, yet it carried an urgency that tightened James's chest. He clenched his seat, his gaze locked onto the planet looming rapidly in the viewport. The surface was a mottled canvas of dark greens and deep blues, partially obscured by swirling amber clouds. It was one of the uncharted moons orbiting a gas giant in a forgotten system, never deemed worthy of a name, only a number, GX-237. The ship shuddered violently as they entered the moon's thin atmosphere. James could hear the outer hull groaning under the stress, the sound mingling with the high-pitched whine of the failing engines. He tried to appear composed, taking his cues from Lyra, who navigated the atmospheric turbulence with an expertise that reminded him how little he knew about her people's capabilities. "We're not going to make it to the rendezvous point," Lyra announced, her fingers dancing over the controls, redirecting what little power they had left to the auxiliary shields. "I'm going to attempt a controlled descent. Hold on." The spacecraft tilted forward, nose diving towards the moon's surface. James's heart raced as gravity clawed at them, pulling them inexorably down. Through the front viewport, he could see the approaching ground, a landscape scarred by rocky outcroppings and vast plains of dark foliage. With a deft maneuver, Lyra managed to level the craft slightly, turning what would have been a fatal plunge into a rough glide. The ship skimmed over a ridge, barely missing a jagged cliff face, before slamming down onto a flat expanse covered in thick, moss-like vegetation. The impact was jarring, sending shards of console and insulation spraying around the cabin. As the dust settled and the echoes of the crash faded, silence enveloped the craft. James exhaled, not realizing he had been holding his breath. He glanced over at Lyra, who was checking her own limbs, and then his for injuries. "We're alive," she murmured, a faint smile breaking through her focused demeanor. Her relief was palpable, mixing with an air of responsibility that she wore like a second skin. James nodded, unstrapping himself from his seat to check the extent of the damage. The cabin was a mess of exposed wiring and broken panels, but the structural integrity seemed intact. "The comms array?" he asked, hoping for some good news. Lyra shook her head, her expression turning grim. "It's gone. Ripped off during our descent. I'm afraid we're cut off." The gravity of their situation settled over James like a cold shroud. Stranded, possibly indefinitely, on an alien moon with no way to call for help. He watched as Lyra accessed a handheld device, her fingers moving quickly over its surface. "We need to find shelter," she said, looking up at him. "This moon isn't just uninhabited, it's volatile. My readings suggest we're in for a severe temperature drop tonight, and the indigenous plant life is active." "Active," James echoed, puzzled. Lyra's next words were hesitant, as if weighing how much to share. "It's Cytheria's red moon phase now. My physiological cycle aligns with it. It affects not just me, but potentially the environment around a Zytherian. It's complicated." James took a moment to process this. Zytherians were known for their close connection to natural forces, a mystical aspect of their biology that was rarely witnessed firsthand by outsiders. "So, what does that mean for us?" he asked, his curiosity piqued despite the danger. "It means," Lyra started, stepping closer to the shattered viewport, "that we need to be exceptionally careful. The flora and fauna here might respond to my condition. We need to find a safe place to wait this out. With a mutual nod, they grabbed emergency packs and, stepping through the wreckage of their ship, ventured into the dense, alien wilderness of GX-237 under the light of its looming red moon. The alien landscape that unfolded before James and Lyra was eerily beautiful. Shadows cast by the towering fern-like trees danced across the mossy ground, creating a tapestry of moving shapes that flickered in the fading light. The air was cool and thick with the scent of an alien flora, rich and earthy, and as they trudged through the undergrowth, it was filled with strange, haunting calls of unseen creatures. Lyra led the way, her device in hand, scanning for environmental hazards and a suitable place to shelter. James followed close behind, his eyes scanning the dense foliage, alert for any sign of movement. Every rustle, every snap of a twig underfoot heightened his sense of alertness. "Here," Lyra finally said, stopping in front of what appeared to be a large outcropping of rocks, partially covered in a thick layer of the same moss that carpeted the ground. It was situated against a cliff face, providing a natural barrier on one side and a rocky overhang that jutted out, giving some semblance of a roof. "It's not perfect, but will have to do for now," she continued, stepping closer to inspect the crevices for small creatures or other dangers. James watched as Lyra moved with a grace that seemed almost choreographed, her every action precise and deliberate. It wasn't just her physical movements that captured his attention. It was her deep connection and attunement to their surroundings that fascinated him. Even in this foreign environment, she seemed to understand and adapt with an ease that was almost supernatural. Together, they cleared the space of loose stones and debris, setting down their packs and spreading out the emergency blankets they had brought. The interior of the cave was damp and cool, the air tinged with a mineral scent that was surprisingly comforting. "As night falls, the temperature will drop significantly," Lyra explained as she activated a small, portable heater from their supplies. "This planet's axial tilt results in extreme temperature variations, and without the sun's warmth, it's going to get very cold." James nodded, setting up a small perimeter alarm around the cave's entrance, a precaution against any local wildlife that might be curious or hostile. As he worked, he watched Lyra, who seemed increasingly preoccupied. Her gaze often drifted to the device in her hand, her expression growing more pensive. "Everything okay?" he asked, not for the first time since they had landed. Lyra hesitated, then sighed. "It's just, the red moon phase is more than just a biological cycle. It's a time of great emotional and psychological significance for my people. It's when we are most in touch with our primal selves, our instincts, and our planet. Being here, cut off, it's disorienting." James sensed the vulnerability in her voice. "How can I help?" he offered earnestly. "Just be here, James. Your presence is more comforting than you might realize," she replied with a small, grateful smile. Then, as if remembering something important, she added, "There's one more thing. Zytherian physiology during the red moon can be somewhat volatile. I may experience heightened senses, strong emotions, and perhaps even some manifestations that might seem unusual." "Manifestations," James repeated, intrigued and slightly alarmed. "Let's just say that our connection to nature can sometimes manifest in tangible ways," Lyra explained, somewhat cryptically. "But don't worry, I have it under control." As the darkness deepened outside, the temperature inside the cave dropped, as Lyra had predicted. They huddled near the heater, sharing a meal of ration bars and water, conserving their resources. The silence of the moon enveloped them, broken only by the distant howls of creatures and the occasional rustle of the wind through the alien trees. Despite the unsettling noises, there was a tranquility to their makeshift shelter. Lyra seemed to settle as the night grew deeper, her earlier tension easing as she adjusted to their new reality. "So, what's the plan for tomorrow?" James asked as they prepared to rest. "We need to explore," Lyra said decisively. "We need to find a water source, and possibly some edible flora. And we need to start thinking about a way to signal for help." "Right," James agreed, though the thought of venturing further into this unknown world filled him with a mix of excitement and trepidation. As they settled down for the night, the eerie glow of the red moon filtered through the entrance of the cave, casting a reddish hue over everything. Lyra seemed to watch it intently, a silent figure of strength and mystery. James realized then that this journey was not just about survival. It was also about understanding, about bridging the vast distances not just between stars, but between beings. As he drifted off to sleep, he felt an unexpected sense of peace, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. As dawn broke over the alien landscape, the light revealed a world transformed. The dense canopy of fern-like trees cast intricate shadows on the ground, and the air was filled with the chirping of distant creatures, creating a symphony of unfamiliar sounds. James stirred from his makeshift bed, feeling the chill of the morning air seep through his clothing. He glanced over at Lyra, who was already awake, sitting cross-legged at the entrance of the cave, her device in her lap. She looked up and caught his gaze, a slight smile curving her lips. "Good morning, James. Did you sleep?" "Well enough," James replied, stretching his limbs, which were stiff from the cold night. "How about you?" "Zytherians don't sleep much during the red moon," Lyra explained, her eyes returning to the device's screen. "It's a time for heightened awareness and connection." James nodded, remembering her words from the night before about the physiological and emotional changes her species underwent during this period. He watched her for a moment, intrigued by the calm aura she projected, despite their precarious situation. "What are you working on?" he asked, moving to join her at the cave's entrance. "Scanning for water sources," she replied, tilting the device so he could see the map it displayed. Several points were marked in a radiant blue, indicating potential sources. "There's a stream about half a kilometer to the north. It looks promising." "Then that's our first stop," James decided, already gathering their small water containers. As they prepared to leave the cave, Lyra's demeanor shifted subtly, her movements becoming more deliberate. "James, before we go," she began, pausing to choose her words carefully. "During the red moon, I might be more perceptive to changes in the environment. I can feel life, in a way that's hard to explain. It's as if the life force of this moon speaks to me." James was fascinated. "So, you can communicate with the planet?" "In a sense, yes. My emotions and physical state might influence the environment around us. It's a two-way connection." Lyra's eyes shone with a mixture of pride and solemnity. "It's a gift, but also a great responsibility." As they walked towards the water source, the landscape seemed to react to their presence. The ground underfoot was lush, the moss springing back with each step they took. The alien trees leaned slightly towards them as they passed, as if curious or acknowledging Lyra's presence. They reached the stream Lyra had identified, and James knelt to fill their containers. The water was clear and cold, running over smooth pebbles and through dense patches of aquatic plants. As he worked, he watched Lyra interact with the environment. She placed her hands gently on a nearby tree, closing her eyes and breathing deeply. "What are you doing?" he asked quietly, not wanting to disturb her, but unable to curb his curiosity. "I'm listening," Lyra replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "The flora here, it's distressed. Something's affecting it." James followed her gaze to the other side of the stream, where the vegetation appeared darker, almost wilted. "What can we do?" Lyra opened her eyes, her expression determined. "Let's find out what's wrong. This could be important." They crossed the stream, carefully examining the affected area. Lyra's touch seemed to soothe the plants, some of which began to regain their vibrancy under her hands. It was a slow, painstaking process, but as James watched, he couldn't deny the incredible connection between Lyra and the alien flora. "This planet, like many, is sensitive," Lyra explained as they worked. "My presence might be influencing it, but it feels like something else is amiss. Perhaps it's an illness or a natural cycle of decay. Could be dangerous." James asked, concerned both for their safety and for the impact on Lyra. "It's possible," she conceded. But understanding this is also crucial. We might discover something vital about this ecosystem. They spent hours by the stream, with Lyra communicating and rejuvenating the plant life. James assisted as best he could, following her instructions to move certain plants into the sunlight or to gather nutrients from the richer soil nearby. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Lyra finally stepped back, sweaty and tired, but with a satisfied look on her face. I think we've done what we can here. The rest is up to the planet itself. They returned to the cave, their water containers full and their spirits high from the morning's small victory. As they walked, James felt a profound respect for Lyra's abilities and her deep respect for life in all its forms. The bond between them, forged under these strange and extraordinary circumstances, felt stronger than ever. That evening, as they sat by the entrance of the cave watching the sunset, Lyra turned to James. "Thank you for being here, for helping me today. I never expected to face the red moon so far from home, but I'm glad you're here with me." James smiled, feeling the weight of her words. "I'm glad I'm here too, Lyra. I'm learning a lot from you about you. It's an honor." Under the light of the setting sun, with the red moon rising on the horizon, their journey felt less like a struggle for survival and more like an unexpected adventure. An adventure that was just beginning. Under the enigmatic glow of the red moon, the nocturnal world of GX 237 came alive with whispers and movements, the air vibrant with the presence of unseen life. James and Lyra sat near the cave entrance, their bodies cloaked in the cool night air, watching the landscape transform as the moon rose higher in the sky. Lyra seemed more attuned, more alive under the moon's influence, her eyes reflecting its crimson light. She was quieter tonight, introspective, as if the moonlight drew her thoughts inward. James respected her silence, sensing that the red moon's phase was reaching a peak that might reveal even more about her mysterious connection to this alien world. After a while, Lyra spoke, her voice soft yet carrying a clear tone of awe. "During the red moon, our legends say that Zytherians can feel the heartbeat of the universe. It's a time when the veil between what is seen and what is unseen thins." James, ever the scientist, struggled to wrap his mind around such poetic descriptions. "And do you feel it now?" he asked, genuinely curious about her experience. "Yes, more so than ever before," Lyra confessed, turning to look at him with a solemn gaze. "Being here, on an unfamiliar moon, the sensations are overwhelming. It's as if this place has its own stories, waiting to be understood." As they spoke, a gentle breeze stirred the foliage around the cave, and a shimmering wave of light seemed to flow from the plants towards Lyra. James watched in astonishment as the air around them subtly glimmered, the natural world responding to Lyra's presence. "Did you see that?" he asked, pointing to the phenomenon. Lyra nodded, a smile spreading across her face. "It's responding to us, or more precisely to me. It happens when Zytherians are in perfect harmony with their surroundings. The environment becomes an extension of our being." Fascinated, James observed as Lyra stood and walked towards a particularly lush fern. She extended her hand, and the plant seemed to lean towards her, its leaves unfurling more fully as she touched it. "This moon, it's young, geologically speaking," Lyra explained, her voice filled with a mixture of scientific observation and mystical reverence. "Its life forms are eager, vibrant, and somewhat naive. They're open to influences, including mine." James followed her, watching every interaction with rapt attention. "What does this mean for us, for our survival here?" "It means we have an advantage," Lyra replied, turning to face him with an earnest expression. "My connection could lead us to resources, provide us with protection. But we must be cautious not to disrupt the natural balance too much." As they explored the area around the cave, Lyra instructed James on how to interact with the plants. Under her guidance, he began to notice subtle changes. A warmth that flowed into his palms as he touched a tree, a slight vibration under his feet as he walked. "It's like the moon is communicating with us," James said, a note of wonder in his voice. "Yes, Lyra agreed. And tonight, I think we can learn even more. The red moon's influence is strongest at midnight. I believe we can use this time to reach out, to ask the moon for help. As midnight approached, they prepared for what Lyra described as a small ceremony. She gathered various plants, forming a circle around a central clearing near the cave. James watched as she moved with purpose, her actions smooth and practiced. When everything was ready, Lyra stood in the center of the circle, her arms raised towards the moon. James felt a palpable energy building, the air thick with anticipation. He stood outside the circle, observing, not wanting to intrude on what was clearly a sacred moment for Lyra. She began to chant in her native language, a beautiful, lilting melody that seemed to resonate with the very air around them. The plants in the circle reacted, their glow intensifying, and the ground beneath their feet thrummed with energy. James could only watch in awe as the ceremony reached its climax. The environment responded with a wave of light and energy that surged through the clearing, enveloping Lyra in a luminescent embrace. The display was unlike anything he had ever seen, a stunning testament to the connection between Zytherians and their natural surroundings. When the light subsided, Lyra lowered her arms, her breath coming in deep, even gasps. She turned to James, her eyes wide with emotion and fatigue. "We have asked for guidance," she said, her voice hoarse from chanting. "Now, we wait for an answer." James stepped forward, offering his hand to help her from the circle. "What should we expect?" "Anything," Lyra replied, a hint of a smile returning to her tired features. "The moon has heard us. It will show us the way." The hours following the midnight ceremony were filled with a charged silence that seemed to resonate through the forest around them. James and Lyra returned to the cave, both too energized by the night's events to feel any fatigue. Lyra's demonstration had opened a new layer of reality to James, a revelation of how deeply interconnected life could be, influenced by forces that were as scientific as they were mystical. As the dawn broke, casting its pale light through the trees, the world of GX 237 seemed to awaken with a renewed vigor. The plants around their shelter appeared more vibrant, and even the air felt fresher, tinged with a palpable sense of anticipation. Lyra, although visibly tired from the ceremony, was attentive and alert. The response might not be immediate, she explained to James as they sipped on a warm, nutrient-rich broth she had prepared. "What we're looking for could be subtle, or it could be profound. We must be ready for both." James nodded, his mind still processing the surreal experiences of the night. "How will we know when the moon has answered us?" he asked. "We'll know," Lyra replied with a smile. "The signs will be clear. Nature doesn't whisper. It sings." Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden rustling from the edge of the clearing. Both of them turned towards the noise, and James instinctively reached for the small tool belt he'd taken to wearing. Lyra raised her hand to stop him, her eyes narrowing as she focused on the bushes. A creature, the likes of which James had never seen, emerged slowly. It was low to the ground, covered in iridescent scales that shimmered in the morning light, with two curious eyes set wide apart on its triangular head. It paused at the edge of the clearing, tilting its head as if assessing the strangers in its midst. Lyra stood slowly, her movements deliberate and unthreatening. "It's a gleith," she whispered to James. "They're usually nocturnal and very shy. This is unusual." James watched in awe as Lyra stepped forward, her hand extended in a gesture of peace. The creature hesitated, then inched closer, drawn by some invisible connection to her. Finally, it touched her hand with its snout, making a soft chirping sound that resonated softly through the air. "This is the answer," Lyra said softly, turning to James with a look of wonder. "The moon is speaking." "How can this be the answer?" James asked, his voice a mix of skepticism and intrigue. "The gleith are sensitive to energy shifts in their environment," Lyra explained as the creature lingered by her side. "Its presence here, now, is a sign that the ceremony worked. We've been accepted by this moon, welcomed by its inhabitants. The realization of what they had achieved, a true communication with an alien world, left James speechless. They spent the morning observing the Gleith, which Lyra named Ilo. It seemed comfortable in their presence, occasionally venturing back into the bushes only to return moments later with what looked like fruits or seeds, offering them to its new human acquaintances. As the day progressed, their peaceful encounter was violently disrupted by the arrival of a storm. Dark clouds rolled in rapidly, the winds picking up with ferocious intensity. James and Lyra scrambled to secure their shelter, protecting their supplies and themselves. "The storms on GX-237 can be deadly," Lyra shouted over the howling wind. "We need to move deeper into the cave." With Ilo leading, they retreated into the cave, the Gleith seeming to understand the urgency. Inside, the sound of the storm was a deafening roar, a stark contrast to the peaceful morning they had enjoyed. They watched from the cave's entrance as trees bent under the wind's force and lightning illuminated the sky in brilliant flashes. "This is another test," Lyra yelled to James, her voice barely audible. "Surviving this will show us what we need to be prepared for." They spent hours huddled in the cave, James feeling the raw power of nature outside. The experience was humbling, reminding him of how small and vulnerable they truly were on this vast, untamed moon. When the storm finally subsided, the world outside was a changed landscape. Many trees were down, their roots exposed, and the ground was littered with debris. Yet, as they stepped outside, the air was crisp and clean, washed anew by the storm's passage. "We survived," James said, relief evident in his tone. "Yes," Lyra agreed, a resilient smile gracing her lips. "And we've learned much. About this moon, about each other, and about what it means to truly communicate with a world not our own." As they began the task of clearing the area and checking for any damage, James felt a new sense of purpose. Their bond, strengthened by shared trials and profound revelations, was now unbreakable. Together, they would face whatever challenges GX-237 had next to offer, with the moon, the Gleith, and the vibrant forest as their guides. In the aftermath of the storm, James and Lyra stepped out into a landscape that had been reshaped overnight. The raw power of nature on GX-237 was undeniable, leaving behind a scene of both destruction and startling rebirth. Fallen trees and scattered debris created new microhabitats, while the rain had coaxed a burst of new growth from the resilient plant life. As they surveyed the area, James couldn't help but feel a deep respect for the force of the natural world and a renewed appreciation for Lyra's unique connection to it. She moved through the devastated landscape with a grace and purpose, pausing often to touch the damp earth or a broken branch, whispering words in her native tongue that seemed to soothe the wounded flora. "The storm has altered the energy here," Lyra explained as James joined her by a large, uprooted tree. "It's a natural cycle, violent but cleansing. We should check the water source again. The stream might have been affected." Together, they made their way back to the stream, finding it swollen but still clear. The surrounding soil was saturated, giving life to a host of small, vibrant creatures that flitted and buzzed around the water's edge. Lyra crouched down, her fingers trailing through the water. "It's all a balance," she said thoughtfully. "Destruction and growth, death and rebirth." As they returned to the cave, James began to feel a slight dizziness, a lightheadedness that he initially attributed to the long hours without food. But as the day progressed, his condition worsened. By evening, he was shivering, despite the warmth provided by their small fire. Lyra noticed his discomfort and immediately shifted into a mode of clinical concern. "James, you're not looking well," she observed, her hand pressing against his forehead. "You're burning up." James tried to downplay his condition. "Probably just a cold," he muttered, though the chills that racked his body suggested otherwise. "There are no minor illnesses on an alien planet, James," Lyra said sternly. "We need to figure out what's affecting you. It could be something from the storm, spores, or a virus native to GX-237. Lyra's medical training, as part of her science education, was basic but comprehensive. She retrieved their first aid kit, which included a diagnostic scanner, and ran a series of tests. The device quickly identified a bacterial infection, likely contracted from exposure during the storm. "We need to treat this aggressively," Lyra declared, mixing a broad-spectrum antibiotic compound from their medical supplies. "You need to rest, stay warm, and hydrate as much as possible." James was reluctant to be sidelined, but he had little energy to protest. He settled into his sleeping bag, his body racked with chills as Lyra busied herself with preparing a medicinal broth. As night fell, Lyra stayed by his side, her presence a comforting constant as he drifted in and out of a fitful sleep. In his lucid moments, he watched her tending the fire or adjusting his blankets, her face set in a mask of focused concern. "You need to let me help you, James," she insisted gently during one of his more wakeful periods. "You've been taking care of everything else. Let me take care of you now." Her care over the following days was a blend of efficiency and compassion. She used her knowledge of local plants to supplement the medical supplies, carefully selecting leaves and roots that her scans suggested possessed antipyretic and antibacterial properties. Under Lyra's vigilant care, James began to recover. His fever broke on the third day, and his strength slowly returned. As he regained his health, he was struck by the depth of their partnership. Lyra had saved his life, not just through medical intervention, but through her profound connection to the environment, which provided the resources they needed to combat his illness. One more day of rest, Lyra instructed as James started to feel more like himself. "We can't risk a relapse." "I owe you one," James said, managing a weak smile. "You owe me nothing," Lyra responded warmly. "This is what it means to be partners, to be friends. We look out for each other." Their bond, already strong from their shared experiences, deepened further through this trial. James realized that their survival depended not just on their individual skills, but on their ability to work together, to leverage their strengths and compensate for their weaknesses. As James recovered, they discussed plans to strengthen their shelter and prepare for any future storms. They also planned to explore more of the moon, mapping it in greater detail and documenting its biodiversity. Despite the challenges they faced, both felt a renewed sense of purpose and a deeper connection to the strange, beautiful world of GX-237. They were no longer just survivors. They were researchers, caretakers, part of the moon's ongoing story of change and adaptation. As the first rays of the new dawn bathed GX-237 in a soft golden light, James stood at the entrance of the cave, taking deep breaths of the crisp morning air. He felt a renewed vitality course through his veins, a testament to Lyra's care and the healing powers of the alien environment. Together, they had not only weathered a storm and a serious illness, but had also formed an unbreakable bond with each other and the moon itself. Lyra joined him, her eyes scanning the horizon. "Today feels different, doesn't it?" she said, a note of contemplation in her voice. "It does," James agreed. "It feels like we're not just visitors here anymore. We're part of this world." They spent the morning preparing for another exploration trip, intending to document the changes the storm had wrought on the local ecosystem. As they packed their supplies, Lyra paused, holding a small, handheld scanner towards the sky. "What's up?" James asked, watching her closely. "I'm picking up a signal," she replied, her brow furrowed. "It's weak, but it's definitely artificial. It could be a passing ship." The possibility of rescue ignited a mix of emotions in James. Part of him longed for the comforts of home, yet another part was reluctant to leave the unique connection they had established with GX-237. "We should prepare a signal, just in case," Lyra suggested, already moving into action. They set up a beacon with the last of their power cells, placing it in an open area where it would be most visible from the sky. As the beacon emitted its pulsing light, James and Lyra climbed to the highest point near their shelter, watching and waiting. The hours passed slowly, each minute stretching out as they scanned the skies for any sign of a ship. Finally, as the sun began to set, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink, a small craft appeared on the horizon. It moved towards them, growing larger and more distinct. It was a search and rescue ship, sent from the Intergalactic Academy after they had failed to check in. The ship landed smoothly on the surface, and 2 rescuers disembarked, greeting James and Lyra with smiles and relief. "We've been looking for you," one of them said, clapping James on the back. "You two are lucky to be alive." As they boarded the ship, James took one last look at the moon that had been their home, their teacher, and their sanctuary. He felt a pang of sadness, knowing that their time here was ending, but also a profound gratitude for all that they had experienced. The journey back to civilization was quiet, both James and Lyra lost in their own thoughts. Once they had returned and gone through the necessary health checks and debriefings, they found a moment to talk privately. "I never would have made it without you," James told Lyra sincerely. "What we experienced here, it changed me." Lyra smiled, her eyes reflecting the depth of their shared experiences. "It changed both of us," she said. "We've seen what it means to truly connect with another world. It's something that few ever get to experience." In the days that followed, James and Lyra worked together to compile their findings and experiences into a comprehensive report. They presented their discoveries to the Academy, emphasizing the ecological insights and the potential for future research on GX-237. Their presentation was met with enthusiasm and curiosity, sparking interest in further exploration missions to the moon. James and Lyra were offered the opportunity to lead these missions, a chance to return to the world that had so profoundly impacted them. As they prepared for their new roles, James reflected on the incredible journey they had embarked upon. They had gone from being mere survivors to pioneers, from strangers to friends who had shared something truly extraordinary. The night before their departure for a return mission, they met at the observatory, looking out at the stars. "Ready to go back?" Lyra asked, her hand resting lightly on James's arm. "Absolutely," James replied, his voice firm and eager. "Let's continue the adventure." As they watched the night sky, their thoughts turned towards GX-237, a distant speck of light among countless others. They knew that the moon would always be more than just a place. It would be a reminder of their resilience, their connection, and the endless possibilities that awaited them among the stars.